Hey, John here. I was just discussing the differences between the MITS Altair 8800 and the IMSAI 8080, at least from the user's perspective, right? Differences in this way the switches might work, the LEDs, the displays and stuff on the front panel. The bottom line is that the IMSAI 8080 has this extra 8 bits of programmed output LEDs on here that the Altair 8800 does not have, okay? And the Altair 8800 has this idea of protection. You can use this switch to protect and or unprotect static RAM from being altered while the programs are running on the Altair, which you cannot do on the IMSAI 8080. Now, while there's no real way to overcome the protect and unprotect feature on the 8080, unless you build a memory card maybe that has a switch on it, you could just reach inside and click it off if you wanted to, or you could hack the 8080 front panel. There were some instructions on how to do that, to add the protect and unprotect feature to match that of the Altair. What you don't have, though, is on the Altair is these LEDs, and there's really, unless you want to drill some holes in your rather expensive Altair machine, how do you overcome this? Well, the answer is one answer for some applications where it makes sense to do so. You can use the address bus LEDs. And the short of it, if you think about it, if the program is accessing some address on the bus repeatedly, especially like if it's in a loop or something like that, then you will see the address on these LEDs. Now, there might be some other flickering as the machine executes other instructions, but in the long run, your eye will smear the brightness out over time. And if you have a pattern that is on these LEDs for the majority of the time, that's what your brain will perceive. Now, this technique is taken advantage of by this guy, Dean McDaniel, who apparently wrote this game called Killbits. While I don't have an Altair 8800, I do have an IMSAI 8080. And we can use that to run this game the same way it would have run on the Altair. And we can see how this technique is used. Now, before we talk about the code and how it's implemented, let's look and see how it actually runs so we know where we're going before we consider how we're going to get there. So let's go ahead and key in the Killbits game. We got a 2-1. 0, 0, 0, 0, 16, followed by an 8, 0, an 0, 1, OE, 00, 1A, that 2, 3, 4 of those, and then I want a 0, 9, D2, 08, 00, a DB, FF, AA, oops, that's not an AA. That's an AA, which is supposed to go into memory at address 1, 2, and that's correct, so I'll just replace it while I'm here. The next one is a 0F. Then I got a 57. C3, 08, 00. And the next byte should be at address 18, and that is correct. I'll just zero some of this stuff out and quickly go back and check to see if it all looks good.
16801 no, that's OE, that's correct. Oh, 1 1A, A, and then we got a 0 9 D2 08 DB FF AA 0F 57 C30800. It's a miracle. Let's go ahead and reset it and run this. And you can see this is the display that's running over here. And this is what's a little bit weird about this particular program. Remember, it was written to run on the Altair, not the IMSAI 8080. If it was written on the 8080, I would assume they'd use the display up here to display this sequence of flashing dots over here. Now, the way this game works is this thing races across the screen right at the moment when it's above one of these switches. If you switch the switch up and then back down right away, you can get the light to turn off, and that's, of course, you've then won the game. If you don't do it at the right time, here, I'll do it on the wrong time on purpose. Yeah, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, right? So what happens is, and I clicked 2 of them instead of 1, made it even harder for myself. It turns out that it creates more LEDs to go on, so now my job is harder in order to get all these to go back off. So the idea is, of course, to get them all to be blank at the same time. So when it goes over the top, let's see if I can get rid of one. It's kind of hard to do this with the phone. I'm recording this with my phone as a video camera, and I seem to be adding more than subtracting. I could use the last one over here, I guess. So when it gets right above this switch here, I'll see if I can turn it off. There's one. Oh yeah, that's making it real easy. That's visually, I'm better off in the middle, I think. Now, yeah, great. Okay, so if you just turn on all the switches, you're in trouble. Okay, here we go. Let's see if I can clean this thing up here and there we go. I'm getting rid of some of them. Oh, come on. Oops, I'm adding more here. Come on. Ah! Anyway. Oh, this is terrible. I'm awful at this. I can usually do it when the thing is in the right position. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to just reset it. There. Go back to just there being one. I win! Anyway, that's the whole point of the game. And, of course, it's still running, so if I do this again, I change it from off to on, right? So that's all there really is to this game. And if you think about it, look back at the source code again, what we're really doing is XORing the value that we read in from these switches with the current value that's in a register that it's scrolling past the screen here. And whenever you XOR, say, a 1 with a 0, you get a 1. If you XOR a 1 with a 1, when the LED's on, you end up with a 0. So that's the mechanism, the instruction mechanism that it's going to use to change the value of the LED when these switches are up. So if I just turn it on and leave it on, as you can see, it continuously XORs the switch value with the bit that you see right there. I suppose if I turn it off at the right time, I will get back to nothing again. Alright, so much for the exciting game of killbits.
I do for 35, 40 years. I've been thinking in terms of Z80 mnemonics. I haven't written 8080 in a long time. So I've taken the liberty of recoding this program a little bit with Z80 mnemonics off to the side. And I've created this file here. So here's the 8080 mnemonics and the object code, the machine code bytes that appear in the PDF that we were just looking at. This is the Z80 equivalent instruction. So if you type this in and run it through a Z80 assembler, you'll get the exact same instruction bytes over here. Okay, so let's see how this program works. first thing we do is put 0 in the HL register. And by the way, there's kind of a bug in this program. As small as it is, I'm a little surprised they didn't catch it. Let's look and see what happened. It's not a bad bug. It'll interfere if you change the speed of the game at some point. Okay, so here's the deal. What we're going to do is we're going to use HL as a counter that's going to be used in a delay loop. Otherwise, the game will go too fast. You won't be able to ever see it happening. So keep that in mind when we see how HL is used down here. Okay. Now, as you can see in the Z80 instructions, add HL, BC to a outsider, a newcomer, is a little more obvious as to what's going on. This calculates HL equals HL plus BC. Well, the 8080 equivalent is DAD B. Okay, now you'd have to, if you've never really written any 8080 before, you'd really need to look this up to see that it does in fact involve the HL register pair and the BC register pair. I believe the D here stands for double add or something like that. And anyway, like I said, I still think in terms of Z80 more often than not. So I'm going to focus on this column here. Okay, I apologize if you're a die-hard old 8080 fan. Okay, so HL register is going to be used for a delay, and we're going to count, and we're going to use this addition here, and there's a jump here that goes back to this label here in this loop here, and we're going to do this loop over and over and over again. And as I said before, the repeated reading from the address in the DE register pair is going to be what's going to light up our address bus. Okay, so this loop here is a little spoiler alert. This loop is everything in terms of getting the lights to light up so you can see what's going on using the most significant 8 bits of the address bus. All right, so spoiler post spoiler alert. Okay, so what do we do here? That HL is going to be used as a delay counter. Okay, D is going to be set to 80 in hex. All right, now the D register is going to get used here as part of the DE pair. And what's going to happen is when we read from the DE pair, the value in D is going to be the most significant 8 bits on the address bus, okay? So this is as the comment says, the initial display bit Z. There should be an S on the end of this thing. Okay? Now, if you don't set the E register, right, because this is loading D, it doesn't load DE. What's in E? Okay? Who knows? It's got garbage in there. Turns out we don't really care. All right, we'll talk about that in a minute. So keep in mind, D is the most significant 8 bits of the address here when we are reading from memory that, in our case, doesn't even exist. And the goal is to simply light up the address bus bits so that the value in the D register is visible. Okay, so what do we got going on here? We load BC with the value E, and they note the bigger value here means that the game will go faster. And we'll see that this gets used down here. It's what gets added to HL when we're in the counting loop here. Okay, so what's happening here? So this is how you set up the main loop of the game, and then you spend the rest of your time executing this loop down here, these 2 loops down here. So what are we doing? We're reading from memory at the address in the DE register pair, and you now know that when that happens, the D register briefly will appear here because D represents the most significant byte of the 16 bits on the address bus from the DE register pair. Now, we need to do that repeatedly, otherwise our eyes are not going to see it, okay? Because it's only going to be on for a few millionths of a second, right? I mean, how long does it take to do one bus cycle? It's only 4 or 5 clock ticks of the CPU, and only 2 or 3 of them will have the address bus bits set and stable. So that's why this is done repeatedly here, okay? Now, this is not enough either. So what we do is we count up to 64K until we have a carry. All right, so what we're doing is we start out with 0 in the HL register. We add this value from the BC register to HL here, and we ask, did the count value go so high as to wrap around from, all binary ones back to 0? When it does wrap around like that, you will generate a carry. So if there has not yet been a carry, we go back up here to this label here, and we hit it 4 more times. Okay, then we add our E value here, and we ask again and again and again. So that's why if you put a bigger value here in the BC register, when this thing runs, it will take less time. You're adding E to, to the value in HL repeatedly. If you're adding 100 instead of, 13 or 14, each time, it will get there sooner, obviously. So that's why this is your game speed setting. Okay. All right. So why do they put 4 in here? Why don't they just count 4 times more? Right. Well, think of this in terms of percentages. Right? What is the duty cycle? Right, of how often the most significant 8 bits of the the DE register pair appear on those LEDs. Right, a load, accumulator from memory. We go back and look up that instruction again in the 8080 Programmer's Manual. That would be a LDAX D. Here it is. It takes 7 time periods to do that. And only 1 or 2 of them, if we look up all the waveforms and open up all the manuals, are the period of time when it actually has the address on the address bus, and it's transferring the data. So you're only looking at 2 or maybe 3 out of 11 time periods when the LEDs are stable. So that's a pretty small duty cycle. All right. Now, how long does it take to do this? How long does it take to do the jump? These things take a long time as well, right? And this one over here, when it's fetching all these extra bytes to get the, the absolute address of this target and so on. So if you only had 1 load followed by an add and a jump, the duty cycle would be very low. Maybe 1 out of maybe 30 or 40 clock ticks. As it is now, it's 1 out of, maybe 15 or 20 clock ticks. So it means that the LED of the most significant 8 bits is set to the value that I want it to be so I can see it longer. Okay, so that's what's going on here. So you write this loop, and because we know that our program exists and executes out of memory, where the most significant byte of the address is all zeros, this also helps your mind smear out and untangle the flickering lights, okay? We know that during all the opcode fetches and all the other time the CPU executes these instructions, except for the time when it's actually going in and trying to fetch the value out of memory at the address in the DE register pair, we know that the most significant 8 LEDs are always off during those times. So it's real easy for your brain to see a little weak flicker, even if it's only 1 out of 15, 1 out of 20 units of time that it's on. You can see that. If you wrote this program and stored it in memory at an address like FF00, if those lights were on most of the time and flickered off a little bit, you probably wouldn't be able to see it at all, okay? It would be very hard for your mind to untangle it. So there are multiple factors taken into account when you're using this particular technique to put something on the display when you're using the address bus. Number 1, put the code that has this loop and holds it on the display in memory below 256 in decimal. Underneath, 00 something something should be the address, all right? That way you got a good chance of being able to see what you want to see. And also make sure that it's on as much as it can be in terms of measuring, the duty cycle of the time that the LED is on. In other words, lay in a few extra reads before you add and ask, am I done yet? And go back to your loop and run it again and again, okay? Now, as far as the rest of the game goes, this is not really relevant, but it's mildly interesting to see what else is going on in here. Here is where we read the, what the Altair calls send switches, or the program data input. This is when we read the most significant 8 switches of on the front panel here. Okay, we get that value into the accumulator. Now, of course, we don't care what we've read from the memory in these instructions here, and we might not even care if there was any memory even there in the first place on the machine that I'm using now. And anybody that could not afford in modern day money, $30,000, which is probably in the ballpark of what it would cost to buy an Altair with a full-blown 64K of memory, if you could even get all the cards in there, okay? Because it didn't have a 22-slot motherboard, unless you stitched in some more small motherboards and wired them all together. Well, if you had an IMSAI 8080, it would have a 22-slot motherboard. You could put all the cards right in there. That's fine. And the power supply had enough to hold up, the voltage for all those cards. But this thing would have been frying like crazy. And again, it would have probably cost you in modern money, a couple tens of thousands of dollars. Point is, you probably don't have much in the high memory addresses anyway. So even if there was garbage and there was actual memory there, what it would do is it would read it, and the data would appear on the data bus LEDs up here, okay? And the executing code would be causing these LEDs to flicker madly down here. So we see when the game actually is played, a lot of these LEDs over here seem to be on or flickering all the time anyway, while these are all black, and unless you see the value in the D register scrolling by over here. My point being, we don't care what's in the accumulator after these loads are done. We just ignore it and throw it away, so we're not destroying anything of value when we read from these sense switches and store it in the accumulator. Here's where we XOR the accumulator with the D register, leaving the results in the accumulator, okay? And the D register, remember, started out with an 8-0. And when the game starts, the LED starts, the display starts with this LED on here. And as the game plays, they scroll to the right, okay? So if any of the switches are in the upward position, that bit in the accumulator during the XOR will be set to a 1, otherwise it'll be set to a 0. With all the switches down, nothing is set. You XOR the accumulator, which is 0, with the value in the D register. You end up with the value in the D register simply being stored in the A register, because that's how the XOR works when one of the operands is all zeros. We then rotate it to the right 1-bit position. Rotate the accumulator, I should say, to the right 1-bit position, and then we load the accumulator back into the D register. So now, assuming all the switches were down, the D would have a 0 or a hexadecimal 40 in it, because it'll have been shifted 1 bit to the right when expressed in hex like that, okay? And then again, we jump back up here to the beginning, or the beg, or the loop, to display the new value in the DE register by using a technique where we just simply repeatedly read from memory at that address, okay? Now, how then, when you switch the switch up, what really happens, right? Well, obviously, if there's a switch up and I read from the sense switch value, let's say I flip up the far left switch over here, right? If I flip this one up and I read from this port, I will get an 8-0 in hex. If they're all down and I flip this one up, I'll read a 0-1, okay? I mean, obviously, because that's what you get in binary when you flip this over to hex. So if I flip up the farthest left switch, A would be set to 8-0. That would be XORed with the value in the D register, which at this stage in our walkthrough would have been set to 4-0 in hex. So if I XOR 4-0 into 8-0, I end up with C0. okay, which is the two most significant bits set to 1 and all the rest set to 0. I rotate that right once, and I end up with a hexadecimal 60. Put that back in the D register and go back to my loop there, and that it would then be the two LEDs shifted to the right one position, so you would see it off, on, off, 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 off in that scenario. Okay, and that really is all there is to the game, right? Obviously, if I flipped up a switch when the LED was on, or the value, the bit position in D was a 1, and I XORed that with a 1, it would become a 0, because that's what the XOR does, and the game continues, all right? And this, of course, is why if you flip a switch up and just simply leave it up, after every time it shifts, it comes back around the loop, and it keeps rereading the same value, it keeps XORing that bit into the same position, and you end up with that inchworm effect of the display continuously scrolling to the right as the game proceeds. So this is the technique that you can use on the Altair to display an 8-bit binary value, or less, or even more, really. I mean, if you wrote that entire program and it all sat in, say, 16 bytes, then the program would only run using memory activity down here. These bits would be flickering, in other words, in order to read all those instructions. And in fact, where does this program run? It runs entirely up to address 17 in hex. That's the address of this last byte right there, which would be what? All these bits, the last 4, actually the last 5 in hex, bits would be flickering. So in theory, this game could have been written to use all these LEDs here. Of course, you could not store this many bits into a single register. You'd have to redesign the game and rethink the thing out, and it'd probably then grow in size, more instructions, therefore consuming more memory, and then you'd be flickering more LEDs in order to fetch those instructions. So the odds are 8 is certainly good enough, and enough to certainly demonstrate this particular technique. So what am I thinking here then? Well, if you want to use this technique, what are the keys? Number 1, make sure that the code that spins in a loop and repeatedly reads from memory so that the address will light these lights up in the pattern you want to see. Make sure that that code all exists in addresses that are less than 100 in hex, or whatever that comes out to in octal. That would be a boy, if you wanted to express it this way, then what you're really looking at is 400 in octal. All right, make sure that all the code is stored in memory in that bottom area, because then when the CPU is fetching the instructions, it won't be causing these LEDs to flicker over here, right? And it'll be easier to see what's going on. Number 2, you need to keep these LEDs on long enough so you can actually see what's going on, which is why you need to do some sort of a loop and or repeated accessing in order to keep those LEDs on. Obviously, they're not going to be on, and you're not going to be able to see what's going on unless you're in this loop and just spinning around and round and round, okay? So this technique is limited to only those cases when you can pause what you're doing long enough to put a value on that display. Now, as I mentioned before, when you use a machine of this class for learning, you're going nuts and you're living with these switches and all this other fun stuff. And if you make mistakes and your machine, causes it to crash or something, and you end up executing garbage from non-existent memory, quite often it's a restart 38. You end up branching to hex address 38. You can put spin loops in there that use this technique to put a pattern here to let you know that a failure has happened, and lock the machine up because it's dead anyway, by definition. If you go into a spin loop with a specific bit pattern on here, that could be your error code. And this is how you could debug your programs. You just go into a spin loop and print a number here. And depending on the number, it would be which spin loop or which value was loaded into D before the spin loop had started running, so you can see the status of your program. And if you're going to write code by just incrementally typing in instructions and debugging it that way, let it run for a while, and then stop it by loading, into your accumulator some value, and then going in or into the D register in this scenario here. I'm looking at the wrong instruction, and then spinning in a loop like this, an endless loop. That can say, I got to this point in my program. And you're like, yay, and everything works great. So you remove that branch into your spin loop, and you write some more code. You change the value that you put into D to some other value so that you can recognize one versus the other. And you run further, and you jump into that spin loop and so on. You do this incremental, stepwise, continuously growing and reinforcing your understanding of your working program. Okay? Now, yes, you might say, why don't I just single step my way through the whole thing? That works fine until your program gets to be a certain size, when you can't just single step forever. You need things like breakpoints and stuff like that. And of course, this machine doesn't have breakpoints. We don't have a ROM monitor. We don't have GDB or in-circuit emulators and all that other fun stuff. They existed, but they were outrageously expensive, probably $100,000+ back in the day. So, what techniques did we use? These are the techniques I used and still use to this very day. And, so why don't you single step? Maybe the point is lost on you. You know how long it would take to single step over 1 million instructions? A long time. That's the answer to that question. How long does it take to go through 1 million instructions and then get into a spin loop? Very little time. Okay. So once you get the basics going, all right, and you've got a certain amount of code working, you can add a little bit and then halt your program and see if the new little bit is working correctly, and keep on growing that way. I use a technique quite often where I store all the registers into well-known addresses somewhere before I enter into a spin loop like that with a status display of some kind somewhere, or I halt the CPU or whatever I'm going to do to stop my program, and then I can go to the front panel and read those memory locations to see if all the values of the registers that were stored in there are what I want them to be. Okay? Again, we don't have a debugger. You don't have JTAG. You don't have, anything like that. How do you do this? All right, that's the technique you'd use. And this is where you would see this in real programs, is my point. This isn't just some stupid game that somebody figured out. This is a demonstration of this technique of how to use the address bus as a display for a status indicator of some kind in your program. Now, that's great. And that's how you can overcome not having a status display at all by using this flickering loop technique. Now, what I did is I went ahead and I said, what if, if I wrote this program, I wanted to port it to the 8080, and I really wanted to use the actual display LEDs, because we have them, right? If I don't have an Altair, I got an IMSAI 8080. How would you do that? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, there's the gameplay itself, and making sure that you wait before you advance and read the switch and rotate to the right, okay? And then there's the lack of a need to read from non-existent memory or garbage memory values or whatever you're going to do here. You can simply output it to the display. Now, in this particular case, what I decided to do is leave the code intact and modify it so that it would work with the programmed output display on the 8080. And keep this same timing, roughly speaking, so that this loop still has to be in here. Okay, now we don't have to repeatedly hit the display and be reading and all that fun. We don't have to repeatedly output to the programmed output port. Okay, but because this program uses the absolute address of this label here buried in the code, which is this address 8, and God forbid I go back and edit this code and change these offsets and relocate it, in other words, we say, in memory. What I decided to do is just stick these instructions here in the program and replace these 4 load instructions with these, okay, and put them at the same place. So this starts at, from address 8, 9, A, and B. Instead of those 4 instructions, I could go from 8, 9, A, and B, and because the out needs 2 bytes here, and I need to output the value from the accumulator. I need to take my value from D, which is my value that needs to be displayed. I need to put that in the accumulator. I then want to output that to the address of the programmed output port, and I need to waste the extra byte so that the offsets in the footprint, as I like to think, the word I like to use, doesn't change. Okay, so in other words, when I say jump to the beginning, it's still at address 8, and all these other things can stay where they are. In other words, I can go to the program that has already been entered into the system and simply replace these 4 bytes here with these 4 bytes here and run this. When it's done, it'll display the value in the programmed output panel instead of in the address bits. So I want to replace the data starting at address 8. I'm going to go examine 8. I want to change that to a 7A. Okay, and then I want to go to a D3. FF, and then I want a no-op to consume that last byte. Alright, so now let's watch and see what happens if we run this one. Okay, now we see the display up here, and we see all the LEDs are quivering. We see that most of the instructions are being fetched and the address range is down here. We know we're down there. Why are these other ones all going on here? And you can even see it flickering a little bit to some degree here. And the reason that happens is because, remember, the 8080 uses the upper half of the address bus to also, during its I/O operations, to include the addresses of the ports that are being touched and stuff like that. So we're going to see some noise in here now. But we're using the programmed output instead of the spin loop on this display. Now, the neat thing about this is that if I stop the program now, this stays set to what the value was. Okay, I can also resume it, and it'll pick up where it was. Okay, now of course the LEDs start out mostly on in this case instead of mostly off in the other case, because remember that the programmed output, for reasons that I know, well, I mean probably for cost reasons, is inverted. Okay, the driver that they chose had an inverted output on it. Or more accurately, I should say that the LEDs are connected the other way around. These LEDs go on when the output's a 0 versus when it's a 1. So I'm mistaken here. It's not that the output of the chip that drives the LEDs is inverted. It's that the logic used when wiring the LEDs put in the other way around. And that's because the drive current for a 0 on most TTL chips tends to be stronger than the drive current for a 1. But otherwise, you can still play the game either way. You could play it to get all the LEDs turned on over the course of time, or you can still play it to turn them all off. You just have more of them to start with. And again, it will inchworm along if you do this right. And of course, I accidentally picked it at just the right time. So in theory, if it inchworms just right, I can shut this off and win it in one single switch. Oops. I almost had them all on instead of all off. Let's try that again. Oh no, it's in a weird pattern. Oh no. Alright, well, this game is interesting, to say the least. Alright, now I got 2 of them here. Let's try and see if I can get rid of one of them. There we go, now the last one. Yay, I got them all off. And now they're all back on again. I should be able to get them. Oh, I left one on. No. Boy. I think what I'm doing is leaving it on too long when I do that. I think when I flip it, what I'm doing is I'm probably shutting the LED off, and then it rotates it and fetches it again, and I turn another one back on again. You gotta be quick draw McGraw here. Alright, so there's the technique that you can use on the Altair to use these LEDs as a display if you want, Or if you're on an 8080, you don't have that problem. You can use this one, and because on an 8080, if I stop it, the display will stay on there. While on the IMSAI, or rather the Altair, that is not going to be the case. So as you can see here, the Altair version will effectively cause the display to blank unless you can happen to stop it right when the load instruction is reading from memory in order to hold the value you want to see on the address bus. So those are the main differences between the Altair and the IMSAI systems and the most basic configuration, at least from the user's perspective on the front panel. Well, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.